On the line with us today, we have the impressive Mark Merkley, and we're going to be discussing his amazing book, Sandra Syndrome, an uncommon love story of true life fiction. Now, it's available for purchase through Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, all the regular online resellers. But if you want to gather everything that Mark has in store, give yourself the best gift you could possibly give and contact markmerkley.com. There, you're going to find more information on Mark himself, more information on this fantastic book, as well as find hyperlinks set up to take you to the purchasing pages. So one more time, you got to check out markmerkley.com. And before we go any further, I want to take this opportunity and point out the fact that Mark was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by one of the best firms in the business, people you already know. I'm talking about Bookmarc Alliance. So for my writers out there, if you have gone through your process and now you need help moving the masterpiece you developed, well, look no further than Bookmarc. They're one of the best in the business to do it. You got to head on over to bookmarcalliance.com and gather all the ways that their fantastic team is going to help you do just that. And listen, it is a true pleasure to have Mark here on the line. Now, people, I'm telling you, we're going to scratch the surface here today, but this book is layered. It is nuanced, and it is going to be filled with so much that you're going to be able to take to the bank. This book discusses topics that are deeply stitched into our society. We're going to cover racism, we're going to cover religion, and everything in between. I'm telling you, it's impossible to get through all of it in a 20-minute interview, which is why by the time we've concluded, you're going to run to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, markmerkley.com, and purchase your copies. All right, because this is one you're going to want to add to your shelf, and this is one that's going to spark conversations with those around you. It's all about the power of compassion, understanding and empathy for what others are going through or may go through in the future. Mark, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you very much for being a guest. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, and it's my pleasure to be on your program. It really is.
Well, Mark, listen, man, the pleasure is truly all ours. I think what you've done by comprising this book is remarkable for so many reasons, a lot of which we're going to cover during today's interview. But first and foremost, let's start off at the foundation, and let's learn a little bit more about yourself. Who is Mark Merkley? Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, I don't know if that is real critical, but nonetheless, I was born in, of all places, Blackfoot, Idaho. Moved to Utah. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is a severely long name, and it's more commonly called the Mormon Church. So even though the church does not like us to say Mormon, that's, hey, go with the nickname because it's shorter and it's only 2 syllables. So I grew up in more of a rural, urban area in Utah, and grew up in the church. But nonetheless, that is not a big or significant part of my life any longer, because during my tentative years of learning, I began to realize that racism, homophobia, and gender bias seem to be significant parts of what I was taught and taught religiously. And that has stuck with me to the point that I wanted to, and especially when I found out about Sandra Syndrome, I wanted to write about this in the context of those aspects, particularly racism, homophobia, and gender bias. So that's how I came up with the idea for this book. In fact, I didn't think I would write it. I told my students when I was teaching at Weber State University, I asked, who in the class are English majors? I said, I've got an idea for a great book if you would write this book. And I told them about my thoughts of what Sandra syndrome could be. But none of my students took it up. So I said, okay. 2 days after I retired, I earnestly began writing a fictional story of a person with a genuine, factually real genetic syndrome. And it's called 46XY androgen insensitivity. And this syndrome has been around for tens of thousands of years. And this was well before Moses, but it wasn't explained in full until 1970. And so I give my recognition to Watson and Crick and the people who found the human genome, the double helix of more than 3 billion pairs of the nucleotides A, C, G, and T, which make up each person now living or has lived, the skills and the behavior that make us what each of us uniquely are. And so that's where I started writing that, and 7 months later I had my first draft. And then through the help of a good writing coach, the book was finished, and now I'm talking to you.
I want to go back into inspiration slightly. And given your background in religion, the way you were raised, how much of that do you think played a part in you feeling as almost that this was a book that needed to be written? I mean, as you mentioned, you actually suggested to some of your students that they write it because nobody took it upon themselves to do so. Well, listen, sometimes ain't nothing to it but to do it, right? And you went and did that yourself. But talk to us not only about what inspired you to create this narrative, but how do you feel your background in religion and the way you were raised placed you in the proper way to be the author behind such a compelling narrative?
Again, Benji, I was taught to be a racist. The Mormon Church in 1978, June 8th, 1978, that was the day that my book begins, the story of Sandra syndrome. And it was on that day, and the church had been in existence for nearly 150 years, but it would not allow Black people as temple-going people. They could not participate in all of the rights, blessings, and endowment that they could receive in any of the holy temples, for the simple reason that they were Black, of Negroid descent. And I've heard those words used in church. And so it wasn't until that day, which was 10 years after the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. And I grew up with Willie Mays as one of my favorite baseball players, just a grand guy. And I could even tell stories of conversations I had with my dad. But nonetheless, boy, I was taught that no. Black people, they have their place and they're set to the side. They do not have the rights and privileges of white people. And so I was taught that racist view. And I'm sorry for that, and I apologize to others that I adhered to it when I should have recognized that it was false. But a revelation came, so we now say, oh, see, we grew up, we now understand it. No big deal. However, the Book of Mormon in and of itself still has the words in it that we used to quote all the time, that the evil people had a skin of blackness. Wow. And they haven't changed the wording in that book at all. It's still a skin of blackness to describe the people who are not spiritually compliant to all of God's requirements. So, yeah, I was taught to be a racist, and my brother may beat me up on that, and he'll say to me, oh, Mort, That's not the way we are. Now, well, okay, fine. But why don't we change the language? Let's get rid of this,
Yeah.
But anyway, and then I found out as well, I enjoyed my science classes when I was in high school and learning about genetics and finding out that you cannot, in athletics, you cannot coach height, speed, nor ability. That's something you just genetically have. You can't coach height.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a taller basketball team, you can't say, okay, you've got to learn to grow. Now get taller. That doesn't happen. That's only something that happens if you genetically have that tendency, or the genetics will allow you to do that. So genetics plays a big part in our life, and it also affects our behavior. And then I recognized the gender bias. Women, in my opinion, are a second-class citizen in most aspects of politics, religion, and in the aspects of education as well. Now, we're moving in better circles to alleviate that, but when I go to church on Sundays, oh my gosh, I still see that. So this is what I had in mind when I was writing this book. How would you feel if you discovered you had 46XY androgen insensitivity? And so for those who are listening, I will give you what that is. Androgen is predominantly a male hormone. And if you have androgen insensitivity, that means you can't process it. The receptors within the human genome just will not accept it. So at conception, Sandra was a boy. But because of androgen insensitivity, he never developed ovaries, fallopian tubes, and she could not have a child because she lacks all of the internal organs to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. Although she does have the outward appearance of being a female. So when they're born, when these people are born, they are genetically male, but they look like a baby girl when they're born. And that's what the doctor says. Oh, you have a beautiful little baby girl here. And it's not until they begin to reach their years of puberty that they find that, man, turning into a woman, but not menstruating. And I even learned when I came here to Phoenix, in this area, that 3 of the top 200 doctors in the world in regard to androgen insensitivity work at the Phoenix Children's Hospital, because that's where people come in with their daughters saying, what is going on? There's something wrong here. And a simple blood test, they find out, they look at the genome. Hey, we need to sit down and talk to you folks, because your daughter is probably going to grow to be the ideal woman, but she is genetically male. And these people do exist. 1 to 2% of the world's population are just like Sandra. Now, to give you an idea of the aspect of seeing this, it's about the same number of people who are naturally red-headed. So when you pass a person on the street who is red-headed, you can now say to yourself, there's someone out there just like that person that is androgen insensitive. They are male, but look like an ideal female. Mm-hmm. And so to me, when I learned about this, it stunned me. It really did. And I began to go to Google, and I started to reference, and I found self-help groups and pictures of these people in these self-help groups that are just absolutely adorable and attractive women. And yet they are genetically male, without ovaries, without fallopian tubes, without a uterus. And therefore they cannot bear a child. And so, like I told you, I told my students, I said, somebody should write a story about this. Can you imagine if some girl was like this was at BYU? So that's how my book started. And so I said, what if there was a person like Sandra who went to BYU? Some guy sees her and says, man, that is one just absolutely lovely looking woman. And that's how the book is. This guy is trying to get this Sandra to fall in love with him. And she just keeps pushing him away because can you imagine being a person like that? And you told him, look, I'm really not a girl. I'm a boy.
Yeah.
And how would you explain that? How would you get them to understand how that is and what happened? Now, can you imagine before 1970, that was the first time science explained androgen insensitivity. Wow. And again, thanks to Watson and Crick, the people who discovered the human genome, what it looks like with all of the nucleotides that make up the ACGT pairings that make us each what we are. Well, wow. And so this is what's the fun part in the book, is because I think my conversations between Sandra and this young man by the name of Luke, when she tells him what she is, wow. I mean, I think that's one chapter that people would enjoy reading. There's some humor in it, yes. You can't help but trip over the humor with it. But on the other hand, my goodness, if I was a person with androgen insensitivity, it would be very, very difficult for me to try and get other people to understand what I am.
You know, Mark, I think this is the reason why your book is so remarkably compelling, is because this is something that has really come to the forefront of a lot of people's perception in today's society. So we know.
Oh, yes, I agree.
Just from the standpoint of the LGBTQ community, this is something that, again, is very pronounced now in society. Not to say that this wasn't always here, it just wasn't things that people were necessarily discussing. Then you add in the extra layer.
Or even understood.
Exactly, yeah. And then you add in the extra layer, again, of race, of religion. This book is nuanced, people. I'm telling you, it's Amazon, it's Barnes & Noble, it's markmerkley.com. You got to head on over there. Pick up your copies of Sandra's Syndrome, an uncommon love story of true life fiction. This is something you need to add to your shelf. My follow-up question for you here, Mark, because listen, I could sit here, man, I could talk to you for hours. There is so much left to be discussed. As we start to close out, my curiosity here, I know what I will assume in terms of what I would take from this book, what I feel my listening audience is going to take from the book. But who better to ask than the author itself, its creator? What are you wanting readers to take from your book upon concluding, Mark?
I hope what they take from that is God creates people for the purpose of testing our own ability to love, for our own ability to accept, for our own ability to understand, and not to try and put up doctrines or dogmas or any kind of symbols that try to separate us from what we are. Yes, I understand that men and women make babies, but the human genome isn't that precise. And we're going to make babies that are going to be Down syndrome, that are going to have other genetic conditions. I'm a type 1 insulin-dependent diabetic. That's a genetic trait. I also point out in the book that there are 2 genetic markers among the human genome called BRCA1 and BRCA2. And every woman should go to their doctor and say, could you check out these genetic markers within me? Because these 2 genetic markers give these women an answer to the problem of cancer, breast cancer, and ovarian cancer. They can just look at your genetic syndrome or your genetic makeup, and if BRCA1, BRCA2, it will tell you if you have a higher or a greater propensity of contracting ovarian and breast cancer. I think I would like to find that out. Now, I'll say this too, that psychopathy and this is a psychopath, they are genetically the same way. There are people out there that 4%, and I even have my own book list if you want to read a great book on this, but 4% of our population are psychopaths. Far fewer than far greater than Sandra, maybe about twice as much. The psychopaths are out there. But I sure would like to know if my son or daughter was a psychopath, because I would do everything that I could to make certain that psychopathy does not get triggered. Or if it is triggered, I want people to know, and I've got to do something to make certain that person does not harm anyone. And I think we need to start looking at the human genome and what we can do to deal with this human genome in regard to what people are. Because we think, all we have to do is just teach them that that's not right. I'm sorry. No, that teaching them that it's wrong to be a psychopath doesn't change their genetic concept of that. Again, you can't coach height. You can't coach speed. You can't coach ability. People who are psychopathic, people who are like Sandra, they're just going to be what they are. They can't help it.
Yeah.
And I hope that people will understand that. We learn to deal with that as a society, and we stop preaching to people about everything that we hear in church about people. We need to understand that people like Sandra and those who are labeled LGBTQ, they are what they are, and they cannot be changed. We have to learn to cope with that. And I hope we learn to love these people. And as you'll read in the book, Luke and Sandra, they do fall in love. They have a special experience together. And I call it a spiritual experience, and they fall in love. And they can't have their own children, so they adopt an Asian child, and they adopt a half Asian black child. This was during the Vietnam era, in this time period. And so the issues of racism, homophobia, LGBTQ, and gender bias, because how would you like to be a male genetically like Sandra, but be a female? Can this person be the president of the United States? Could they be a leader? Can they be, they're queer, and boys, and when Sandra talks about herself as being queer in the book, it breaks her heart, because she's been taught that she is queer, and she doesn't like that word. And I wouldn't either. But yet it's a word that we use, and that's unfortunate. I hope that we will come together more as an aspect of love toward one another, rather than bias, bigotry, or any of the other aspects which separate us as human beings. That's what we are. No matter what our color, no matter what. It's just what we are, and that's genetically how we were created.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, listen, in this ever-changing world, I think how we continue to change with it is continuing to have conversations. The only way we can get to a more enlightened state, the only way we can get to a more cohesive society and accepting society, and I don't know, maybe that's just the optimist in me, but I think we can get there. But the only way that happens is through constant communication. And listen, people, this conversation, just like his book, is layered. It's nuanced. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to take time. It's going to take dedication. But I believe wholeheartedly that we can get there. This book, Sandra Syndrome, is the precipice to so much. But understand, the precipice is solely what it is because there's a lot of work after you've completed reading those words on the pages. Our work is still cut out for us, but it's a start, and it is a magnificent and a powerful one at that. So you have to head on over to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, markmerkley.com to begin this journey. Mark, you are truly an embodiment of a person of distinction. It has been an absolute honor to have you here with us. Thank you once again for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Thank you so much for giving me a voice so that I could express how I feel, because we need to love all people, and I will open myself to come and speak to anybody